The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda, John Michael McGrath and I with our weekly onpoli podcast. Governments everywhere depend on taxes from gasoline a lot. And if you've got a lot of EVs and a lot fewer people buying gas, you do have to replace that money somehow, don't you?
Yeah, one answer is no, you don't, right?
Then, later on The Agenda.
That's exactly what app developers do every day. And they give these little addictive apps to everyone, almost totally regardless of age, for free. And you know, when the product is free, that means you're not the customer. You're the product.
Okay, partner. First of all, a couple of things off the top here. Yes, my throat is terrible tonight, as you can probably hear. I was at the Leaf game the other day, and it was 1-1 going into overtime. And Austin Matthews, of course, he's truly amazing. He is truly. Do you know who I'm talking about, first of all?
He is a hockey player.
Oh, my goodness. I have so much work to do with you. But yes, Austin Matthews, who is the greatest goal scorer of this generation, popped one in overtime, and I guess I overdid it. And anyway, so I'm not going to sound too good for
this is why I don't do live sports, because I got to keep the voice fresh for the one podcast a week I do.
Very good. Very good. Now, second thing, I see you are sporting a different shirt this week. And
yes.
Back in my day, we had 9 planets. So this is a reference to?
The former unjustly maligned planet of Pluto. Those of us who watched this drama unfold over, it took, I think, most of a decade. But yeah, Pluto was stripped of its title as a planet. But I guess in this case, I'm insisting on the old orthodoxy.
Do you know what I found very funny about that shirt was not the part that you found funny, but I always find it amusing when someone as young as you says, back in my day. Did you have a day?
Well, I mean, we're going to be talking about the 1980s a lot. And, I was born in 81, and a lot of my early memories are the 1980s. And so, yeah, I think of myself as like an 80s and 90s kid.
There you go.
Old enough to remember the sound of a dial-up modem. That's what distinguishes me from, let's say, some of our younger colleagues who are coming up behind me and young, talented people. And I just see them in the rear view, and I'm realizing, oh, gosh, my day is coming.
You know we call people like that? Whippersnappers. Young whippersnappers. That's what I call them. I'm going to point to something on my shirt. Do you actually know what that is?
That would be the Hamilton Tiger Cats.
Correct. How do you know that?
Well, I have been hosting a podcast with you for the last several years.
He can be taught. All right, that's great.
By osmosis, if nothing else.
I know football season is still 4 months away, but I'm getting ready, okay? I'm getting ready.
Absolutely.
Anyway, shall we do it?
Let's get to it.
On to issue 1. Okay, here's the situation. Highway 401 across the middle of the Greater Toronto Area is used by truckers a lot. Highway 407 across the top of the GTA isn't used by truckers very much at all because it is a toll highway. Costs too much to use. So the official opposition, you Democrats, thought, why not take the tolls off the 407 for truckers? It would presumably ease up on the congestion on the 401 and encourage greater use of the 407, which is quite underutilized. NDP leader Marit Stiles saying the Premier is too afraid of the private operator of the 407 to do it. Doug Ford, to say the least, disagrees.
So back to the Premier, when are you going to start prioritizing the interests of Ontarians instead of big corporations?
Speaker, let me get this right. You're against the 412 and 418. You voted against getting rid of the tolls. You voted against the 413. You voted against the Bradford bypass. You voted against the largest transit expansion in North America. But, which way are you going today? Are you going one way? Are you going the other way?
Ah, yes, a little bit of the exchange from the House this past week. Now, the official opposition indicate that they have done a study by a group called Environmental Defence, which says if we did what the NDP are suggesting, it would obviate the need to build that Highway 413 at a cost of $6 billion. It would avoid damaging the Greenbelt. It would save truckers 80 minutes of travel time through the GTA. So, add all that up, and I'm going to ask you a question I already know the answer to. You think the premier is considering changing his mind on this?
We know that he is not, at least not right now, because the Tories, the majority in the legislature, did vote against the NDP motion and sent it to purgatory.
Is there a reason that they oppose the NDP motion other than it's a motion put forward by the NDP?
Well, I said this last week that, this idea keeps being proposed as an alternative to building the 413 highway. This would go across the sort of the northwest of the GTA, I guess. And this government is not looking for an alternative to build the 413. They want to build the 413. So they just want to keep going ahead with that. I do think it's fair to say that there's a bit of an inconsistent attitude, let's say, towards tolls with this government, where they went through this big song and dance about prohibiting new tolls on publicly owned highways, but they are not considering, at least do not seem to be considering, a measure like this, which is a real tangible thing that the government could do at the cost of some money, and we'll get into that. But it is a tangible thing they could do to affect congestion and potentially improve people's lives pretty quickly.
Well, that's what I wondered, because you could be in favor of building the 413 and still do this anyway, because after all, it's going to take a decade to build the 413, right? It's not going to be around for a while. And traffic, presumably, on the 401 is only going to get worse between now and when the 413 is ready. So is there any way that the province could be better utilizing the 407 in the interim?
Well, that's part of the appeal of this whole idea, is that you could actually implement it relatively quickly. Maybe it couldn't be done instantaneously, but it seems like plausibly the kind of thing that you could get up and running in a year's time, let's say, whereas it will take something like a decade to build the 413. So you could do this faster. Environmental Defense argues that it would be cheaper to do so. They say $4 billion over 30 years, as opposed to somewhere between $6 to $10 billion to build the 413. But the government is, as we say, not like super interested in this idea. Worth noting here that the 407 is actually one of the most expensive toll highways in on the continent. Its rates do continue to go up, and because it is privately operated, and the conditions of the lease that the province signed back more than 20 years ago, the province really doesn't have any kind of lever to pull in terms of lowering those rates.
Now, you went on the record last week with a position that will be extremely popular in the suburbs of the Greater Toronto Area. Namely, you're in favor of toll highways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in general, we are not going to build, let's say, something analogous to like the DVP or the Gardiner in downtown Toronto again. The era of big highway building, at least certainly in the core of the region, is basically done, and I think we can sort of admit that. And so, how do you handle congestion without trying to, do these massive new engineering projects? Well, toll roads are a tried and true method to do that. Even in places where they are expanding highways, and I think of like there are cities in Texas. Texas loves highways. Everything's bigger in Texas. But you see time and time again, like you add 4 lanes to a highway on the promise that it's going to save drivers 5 minutes in their commute.
Never does.
Yeah, like
Never
a
does.
year later, it's back to, or in fact, congestion can even get worse. Yeah, I think that toll roads are a solution to congestion that actually works. And I think this is not an issue right now, but as we have more electric vehicles on the road, the government is going to be looking for some way to replace the gas tax. And, you already see lots of jurisdictions around North America trying to figure out what that's going to look like. Road tolls might be one answer.
That is a really good point. I had forgotten the notion that governments everywhere depend on taxes from gasoline a lot. And if you've got a lot of EVs and a lot fewer people buying gas, you do have to replace that money somehow, don't you?
Yeah, one answer is no, you don't, right? Just let and this would be, I think, an answer that Doug Ford would be totally comfortable with. Right now, we don't have to replace the gas tax. Let the consumers keep that savings, and we'll figure out another way to bring that money in, right? Income taxes and sales taxes still work. But I think in general, governments kind of certainly, let's say, bureaucrats in the finance ministry probably start to get hives when you say, like, when you talk about not replacing the gas tax.
There you go. Now, let us also state your dirty little secret, well, dirty little not so secret for the record.
Yes.
You don't own a car, do you?
I don't. No.
You take transit and you bicycle everywhere?
Yeah, no.
And walk.
I walk, I bike. I bike through most of the year. I did not bike a lot in December and January this year, but we're recording this in early March, and I biked to work today.
So people who drive cars for a living may not love your solution.
They might be
is what I'm trying to say.
Foaming at the mouth. It does seem self-interested, I grant. But I do certainly, I rent cars frequently. I have family who live all over different parts of the province, and we rent a car when we need to. I actually do enjoy driving once you get out of the city proper. So I'm sympathetic to the ideas that, like, driving is a lot of fun. But yeah, I'm not the ideal spokesperson for this idea.
I just can't wait for you to run for office in the north end of Etobicoke on the platform of bicycles for all, and we're going to toll all your roads.
Oh yeah, no, there's a reason I will never hold elected office. All of my views are politically unpopular.
Now, let us just, before we leave this subject, give credit where it's due, because it was the leader of the Green Party, Mike Schreiner, who was the first to float this idea almost 2 years ago. Didn't go anywhere then, may not go anywhere this time, because, of course, the Ford government does seem determined to build 413. But let's just take a second and talk about the politics of all this, because I found it fascinating that the government, I think in a very real respect, got itself outflanked by the NDP on the issue of consumer choice and affordability. And if we know this Premier, we know those are issues that are near and dear to his heart. And my suspicion is, and I got nothing to hang my hat on here other than just suspicion, had he announced this idea, it would have been consistent with his brand, and I could imagine him, beating the drum for this. I can imagine he would like this a lot. And yet, the politics of it, seems to me, he got outflanked by the NDP on it.
Yeah, and so, you ask, like, why isn't the government embracing this kind of a notion? And to go back to the cost, right, like, it would be a substantial cost, right? The environmental defense analysis looked at, I think, in the range of $260 million a year. I think there's reason to think that number might even be conservative, that, it could potentially be more than that. And, governments are funny, like, in some ways, if they talk about spending like $1 billion in one big lump sum versus a few hundred million, but like a few hundred million a year for 10 years.
Right.
They're like, actually, they'll be more nervous about the smaller expense over a longer period of time, right? They, like, it's the ongoing expenses that make, again, those bureaucrats in the finance ministry, it's those ongoing perpetual expenses that make them nervous. So I think that would be one reason, because, of course, the other issue that is sort of in the background of everything this government does, and, this has been a very common story over the last, let's say, few decades, is just trying to balance the budget. This Premier and his finance minister, Peter Becklenfalvy, would very much like to balance the budget before the next election. And adding even a few $100 million a year in new ongoing expenses, potentially for decades to come, that makes that idea of balancing the budget harder to get to.
And they announced Budget Day just yesterday, right? March 26th is going to be Budget Day.
Tuesday, March 26th. Right. So I imagine you'll be covering that intensely on the agenda, and then you and I will...
I suspect we will both be doing something on that.
And then you and I will be discussing it on the podcast later that week.
Good stuff. Okay, on to issue 2. This week, Education Minister Stephen Lecce announced the province has a tentative agreement with the Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association. The teachers will have a chance to ratify, or not, on March 26. If they do, it means the government will have successfully achieved labor peace with all of the teacher unions. Okay, JMM, how big a deal is that?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a big deal that it's a big deal for any government when they secure this kind of labor peace among the education sector. Really, potentially the most disruptive thing that can really derail a government's agenda is like a big teacher's strike. So when you get to avoid that, I imagine there's a lot of people breathing a sigh of relief in the Premier's office. But of course, the process has not been without controversy, I think we could say.
You are quite right about that. Do you want to take us through some of the controversies along the way?
Well, so, I mean, I think you have to go back to Bill 124, which this government introduced in its first mandate. It was, in fact, Peter Bethlenfalvy, before he was Minister of Finance, introduced this bill that constrained the growth of public sector compensation. I think, as we always do say when we talk about this bill, that it did affect those of us here at TVO, and we're just going to concede that and keep on moving. That was obviously extremely controversial. It was eventually ruled unconstitutional by the courts, and the government has decided not to appeal it all the way to the Supreme Court. So they've accepted the judgment of the Ontario Court of Appeal that it was unconstitutional. That is going to have some knock-on effects in terms of the government's finances. They will probably end up paying retroactive pay to some unions to make up for the wages that were lost due to Bill 124. It seems like wild that this was like 18 months ago, but of course the government also briefly invoked the notwithstanding clause to try and prohibit strikes by the teachers' unions. That was a huge controversy. The government eventually backed down, repealed that bill that had threatened to use the notwithstanding clause. And then, just as another little legal factoid, they declared that the labor dispute that had happened was never illegal, because you can retroactively declare things to not have happened when you're the parliament or the legislature. And the unions were they had voted for strike mandates in many cases. So there was at least the real potential of some disruption during the school year here. And the fact that the government has extricated itself from these problems without getting a strike, without any massive disruption to the school year, as I say, people breathing a sigh of relief, I imagine.
Indeed. Now, I imagine some of you are asking yourself, has this ever happened before, where we got labor peace with all of the different teacher unions all at the same time? And the answer is yes. This is not unprecedented, but it has not happened in a long time. The last time labor peace broke out was in 2008. Premier Dalton McGuinty was in charge. His government successfully bargained with all of the teacher unions. And I think some of us who follow this stuff will remember that the Minister of Education at the time was
Kathleen Wynne.
Kathleen Wynne.
Yes.
There you go.
This is a recurring story in Ontario politics. As education has become more and more central to what the provincial government does, right? We're no longer in the, early 1900s when education was like just a purely local matter handled by school boards, right? It really has risen to a central focus in provincial government. And so, you go back to the 1970s when I was in elementary school in the 1980s, and then of course, during the Harris years of the 1990s, right? Labor
days of action.
Yeah, exactly. Labor disputes in the education sector. I mean, I don't think I had a single school year that wasn't disrupted, at least somewhat, between, grade 9 and I was one of the last years to have OAC, or grade 13, right?
You probably did not enjoy the fact that your school year was disrupted, but I think most kids probably were.
I found other things to do.
Okay. All right, good.
I do find myself wondering if this is also at least a little bit of like a COVID hangover, right? I actually have not asked any of the union leaders this question, and maybe I should, but I find myself wondering if they were really confident that after 2021 and a bit of 2022, when schools were, shut down briefly, how much support they think they would have had among Ontario's parents if a strike had shut down schools for a lengthy period of time. Maybe they would have had a lot of support. I think there is some sympathy to teachers just generally in the public, but I think it's a question worth asking.
Indeed, very fair point. The other thing that is new here is that the government managed to get these agreements in large measure because they punted the toughest issue, namely wages. and they punted that off to binding arbitration. Now, most governments, of course, like to avoid binding arbitration because they always fear that the arbitrator is going to be too generous with the union in question, and governments don't want to be too generous in the money they have to pay out in salaries and wages and so on. For some reason, this government has embraced binding arbitration as a way to resolve these disputes. Any idea why Minister of Education, Stephen Lecce, has been open to going to binding arbitration in the case of the teacher unions here, but not necessarily with any other unions?
Well, I mean, there's a few different possibilities. One is that they have a better sense inside cabinet of what the government's finances are than necessarily us mere mortals on the outside. And they might feel like they've got a little bit more room to maneuver in terms of teachers' compensation than they did even a year or two ago. The economy is recovering reasonably well from COVID, and there's been a lot of job growth and some income growth. And the government may simply feel like, you know what, if we, when you're talking about the education ministry, right, like even small changes in teachers' compensation can be billion-dollar bills.
For sure.
But they might feel like they've got the room for that in the budget. We do know that the Financial Accountability Officer has just issued a report recently where they talked about the government has socked away a bit more money in some of its contingency funds that we don't have a explicit explanation for yet. So that might be the kind of thing that where it might be that combined with the need to probably pay some retroactive pay for Bill 124, that might explain some of it.
I think we'll find all that out on the 26th of March.
I think
Budget
we might.
day. I think we might. Okay, on to your column, my column. Okay, it's time now for a regular feature that we call Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns that we wrote for the TVO website, tvo.org, over the past week. Go ahead, start us off. What have you got up your sleeve?
So both of my columns this week are kind of dull affairs about really wonky matters of housing policy.
Are you supposed to admit that?
Well,
It is on brand for you.
it is what it is. And I could go on about, the policies of like, how do we finance sewer construction? But I did that on the website and people can read that. So instead, I'm going to do something different here. Okay. We are going to return to something we used to do quite a bit more, which was quotes of note. And I'm going to take a clip from the Minister of Natural Resources and Forestry, Parry Sound Muskoka MPP Graydon Smith. Let's have a listen.
We will be remorseless in our blah, 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 blah. Some days you got it, and some days you don't. But we will not stop in our efforts to get this mill open.
Okay, first of all, you got to hand it to him. He was just having one of those days. He's normally very good on his feet during question period, but as you and I both know, some days your tongue doesn't work and you just can't get the words out. And he had one of those moments.
Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, when you're speaking live to a camera and the Hansard, you don't get to edit your flubs out. So we're absolutely not dunking on the minister in this case. It happens to the best of them. But it's an interesting moment because the minister, obviously, we're having a bit of fun with the clip, but the minister was responding to a question from the official opposition about a pulp mill in Terrace Bay, which is on the north shore of Lake Superior. It's about 250 kilometers northeast of Thunder Bay. And that mill has been closed, perhaps temporarily, but the Union and the New Democrats were at Queen's Park earlier this week, earlier that day. They were really raising a concern about whether that mill is going to reopen. They say they've had no real communications with the ownership of the mill. And, obviously, we like to, when we can, cast our view around the province to communities that don't necessarily get a ton of attention. This has been an issue we've seen. I wouldn't say it's been super common, but we've seen it a few times in the last few years where in some cases these are mills that got substantial government funding for things like refits or environmental sustainability grants from either the federal or provincial or sometimes both levels of government. And then they shut down and there's no accountability for like, where did that public money go? Did it just get sent off to the shareholders of a foreign multinational? Or, so that's a whole issue. And the other question, frankly, that we've seen in other communities, and I think it was Iroquois Falls about a decade ago now, where the mill shut down and the owners of the mill effectively refused to let it reopen as a functioning mill. They sold it. They eventually sold it to the municipality, but it was on the condition that it could not be reopened as a pulp mill. So lots of really, let's say, tumultuous times in the forestry sector. Obviously, this is a story that goes back a while. It's been kind of a rough few decades for the forestry sector in the North. But this was an issue. I mean, obviously, as I say, we're pegging it to a kind of a funny clip from Question Period, but it was an issue that I thought we could talk about a bit more.
Good stuff. Well, I had a couple of columns this past week about Brian Mulroney. Yes. For obvious reasons. We know Canada's 18th Prime Minister died last month, February 29th, actually, at the age of 84. Two different columns. The first one focused on Mr. Mulroney's relationship with the three premiers of Ontario that he mainly had dealings with during his time. That'd be Bill Davis, David Peterson, Bob Rae. Frank Miller was also premier during this time, but for such a short time, there wasn't really much to talk about there. The point was this: yes, Mr. Davis and Mr. Mulroney got on very well, of course, because their brand of progressive conservatism was relatively similar. But it's also right to say that Mr. Mulroney got on very well with David Peterson, with whom he negotiated the Meech Lake Constitutional Agreement, and also with Bob Rae, with whom he negotiated the Charlottetown Accord. Two attempts at constitutional renewal. Ultimately, neither one enacted, but that's not to say it wasn't worth the effort. I also did another column last week on the fact that the three titans, we got Brian Mulroney, we got John Turner, we got Ed Broadbent, who fought two historic elections in 1984 and 1988 against one another. And with Mr. Mulroney's death, they're all gone right now. And it really felt like a kind of just like a real turning of the page of history right now to see these three titans who would go after each other hammer and tong in public, like absolutely brutal against each other, but behind the scenes actually quite admired, liked, and respected each other. And I'll give you just a couple of examples here. Brian Mulroney, after beating John Turner twice in the 84 and 88 elections, when Mr. Turner stepped down as Liberal leader, offered him the ambassadorship to both Italy and the Vatican. Mr. Turner was a staunch Catholic, right, and he would have really enjoyed those posts, and he would have represented Canada well, but he decided he wanted to go back to Bay Street, make some money. But the point is, Mr. Mulroney made the offer. Mm-hmm. And as Ed Broadbent stepped down around the same time as well as Mr. Turner, he was given the presidency of a group that was being created called Rights and Democracy, which was an attempt to export both around the world. And the gist, of course, that the column tries to make the point that it's one thing to go after each other in public, but behind the scenes, civility, respect, admiration, those are nice things. They had them then. I don't know if we have them today. I know we're going to go into the mailbag in just a moment, but I wanted to read this here because it is related to this subject. This is from a former member of the Ontario Legislature named Jim Folds, who was the NDP member from Port Arthur from 1971 to 1987. I think his son Andrew actually is a member of the Thunder Bay City Council today. Anyway, another generation. Apropos of my column that the three titans of the 1980s elections are gone, Mr. Folds wrote the following: "We fought just as fiercely, if not more so, at Queen's Park, and I have the scars to prove it, and I am proud of every one. But like professional athletes, we had respect and admiration for those opponents who deserved and earned it, and we concentrated on the issues. More importantly, we did not doubt 99.9% of our opponents were in politics to serve the public good. I think also we mostly had a sense of fun and humor about our craft and about ourselves and about our opponents, which helped to keep us balanced. When I think about politicians as different as Bill Davis, Darcy McHugh, Bob Nixon, Jimmy Auld, Bob Welsh, Floyd Logren, and Eli Martell, they all had this sense that they took their work seriously, but they didn't take themselves too seriously." That's from Jim Folds from Thunder Bay, and I really like that take on politics, so I thought I'd include it here.
Yeah, and you do still see glances of that at Queen's Park today, I would argue. There is still congeniality and collegiality, but I think it would be fair to say it's rarer than it used to be. One thing I will say, and I'm not inventing this, I'm drawing from work done by the Samara Center for Democracy. In the federal parliament, it does seem like that collegiality has almost entirely disappeared.
Right.
They've had reports where MPPs talk about not even feeling like they can have lunch with members from the other side of the aisle because members of their own party will, whisper and ostracize them, for even just talking to the other side.
Which is nuts.
Which is nuts, absolutely nuts. And I don't think it's quite that bad at Queen's Park yet. I mean, even that moment that we played earlier with Graydon Smith, I mean, yeah, like I'm sure that in the moment, maybe the opposition parties might have been like pointing and laughing at him, but they've all been there. They've all had those on-camera fumbles, and after the camera was turned off, I'm sure some people, said, "Hey, don't worry about it," right?
I have no doubt. Let me do one last note about this issue, and that is, ironically enough, one of Mr. Mulroney's greatest rivalries was with the current Prime Minister's father, because it was Pierre Trudeau who repatriated the Constitution with an accompanying Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But because there was a separatist government in Quebec at the time, he did not get Quebec's signature on the agreement. Mr. Mulroney did achieve that with Meech and with Charlottetown, both of which died for other reasons, but Quebec did sign both of those agreements. And the expression we heard back in the day, as your shirt said, the expression we heard was, Brian Mulroney's going to finish the job that Pierre Trudeau started by getting Quebec's signature. Mr. Trudeau, on February 29th, 40 years ago, went for that famous walk in the snow and decided at that moment that he was going to retire from public life. And Mr. Mulroney, this year, on February 29th, died. For two men who really were great political rivals, the notion that they will share that extraordinary day, February 29th, which only comes along once every 4 years, I don't know. I find that intriguing.
Yeah, sometimes the stars align in just weird ways. And with that, on to our mailbag.
If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, please send it along to us at this email address, onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, what do we got to start this week?
Here's an email from a listener, Andrew Hunter, and a continuation of our discussion around the 407 highway. Andrew writes, "Hey, Steve and JMM, still faithfully listening to the podcast, so I'll have to check out the video to see your sartorial choices." Timely. Something worth noting is the road surface on the 407 was designed for heavy truck traffic, as are some of the new 401 sections near Huron, Ontario. Paying the tolls for trucks would increase the lifespan of the asphalt surface of 401, and on connecting municipal roads for trucks destined for the industrial land the 407 passes through. Win-win, Andrew Hunter.
Oh, that is interesting. What's he referring to there?
So the 407 has a more durable highway surface, like most roads you've ever driven on in Ontario. The uppermost layer of the road is just asphalt, very common. But the 407 actually is topped with concrete, makes it much more durable. It lasts longer compared to asphalt. Maintenance costs can be higher, but it's a question of, do you get what you pay for? Road engineers, I'm sure, geek out about this stuff. It does make it more difficult to repair in some cases. You have to lift slabs of the highway out and replace it with concrete. Whereas fixing a pothole in the 401 is pour some asphalt in it and
there you go. Do you know what I've noticed? And I'm not on the 407 a lot, but sometimes when I go to Hamilton, I take the 407. It's noisier. It's a lot noisier driving on the 407. And I don't mean the other traffic. I mean rubber hitting road is noisier on the 407 than the 401. Why would that be?
Well, so it's just the difference that the difference in the noise that the tires make rolling over concrete versus asphalt. The concrete actually has to be brushed a little bit to give it some texture. It would otherwise settle into a pattern that would be too slippery for road safety. So they add just a little bit of texture to the concrete in order to improve road safety. But a side effect of that is you do get a bit of noise.
Huh, never knew that. Okay, let's continue. Here's an email from a listener named Felix who asks, "Hi, Steve and JMM. Do we know what the provincial cabinet committees are and what their membership is? A little searching does not yield any recent results, even for a statutory committee like the Treasury Board. Best, Felix." Okay, Felix, this is deep in the nerdy weeds of how governments work, but traditionally you got a cabinet and then a bunch of cabinet subcommittees, like priorities and planning is often one, social services, economic development, that kind of thing. Do we know what this particular government of Ontario has?
We know for sure that there are at least 3 cabinet committees because Ontario law requires that those committees be created and that the Premier publish the membership of those committees. So that's the Management Board of Cabinet, Treasury Board, and the Cabinet Committee on Emergency Management. So there are Ontario laws that created those committees, or at least require them to be created, and require that the members be appointed by an order in council. The orders in council are public documents that you can look up in Ontario. They're not always published in a timely fashion, I will just say, as my gripe as a journalist, but they are published online, and you can look them up. Different governments have taken, I would say, different attitudes towards how open they are about cabinet committees. I think under Kathleen Wynne, for example, it was more common for the government to be forthcoming about the membership of cabinet committees. With the current government, I don't. It's possible I missed it. I don't remember any press releases announcing the membership of cabinet committees. You just sort of have to root through the listings for the orders in council.
Gotcha. Let's finish up on this one here because it relates to something we talked about last week. Remember last week we talked about heritage properties and the difference between being listed, being designated for preservation. There were some different nuances there. And I mentioned at the time that I remember covering this story almost 40 years ago. There was a train station in the west end of Toronto that I thought had been designated for preservation, but CN Rail tore it down anyway because they wanted to do some different kind of development there. And I remember Mayor Art Eggleton showing up at the time and having a press conference decrying how the railway took down that historic station seemingly against the wishes of the city. I got this note on that story. It says, "Hi, Steve. On one of your recent programs, I believe that you indicated that a designated heritage railway station in the city of Toronto had been demolished with no penalty to the demolisher. I was head of the Historical Preservation Division of the Toronto Historical Board before retirement many years ago. As I recall it, designation by bylaw under the Ontario Heritage Act is done by city councils passing a municipal bylaw. But municipal bylaws do not bind the Crown. And so it seems that railway properties, being federal, could not be designated. My recollection is that the railways demolished a station in the Junction area of Toronto, that's the one I went to, and also a station around King Street west of Dufferin. These properties were probably listed, i.e. included on the city's then inventory of heritage properties, so I don't think the city had the power to place a penalty on the demolisher of listed properties. Best wishes, Marcia Cuthbert," and she signs it Vic 59. So I guess she graduated from Victoria College at U of T in 1959, and that would explain why nobody was punished 40 plus years ago when those train stations were unilaterally demolished. So thank you, Marcia.
I want to put a spotlight on this because this is one of my favorite little topics. I have many, but because of course planning powers, municipal planning powers derive from provincial law, but the province cannot impose any kind of legislation in an area of federal jurisdiction. Railways are a matter of federal jurisdiction. So if CN wants to build a train station or knock down a train station, that's purely a federal matter, and municipal planning policies cannot apply. CN could choose to comply with a municipal planning policy, but there's actually, there has been a long-running issue. I think it's basically settled now because it went all the way to the Supreme Court, but out in Milton, I believe, the CN wants to build a new train yard there on their rail line, and it conflicts with the planning policies of the local municipality, and I think the regional municipality as well. But CN is like, your laws don't apply to us, more or less, and they are 100% correct. It's the kind of thing that crops up.
You have a glint in your eye right now. You are so excited talking about this kind of stuff. It really turns you on, doesn't it?
Federalism and planning law, and who doesn't love a good story about trains? I mean, it's got everything.
Maybe. Anyway, okay. I was going to say something, but I'll take it back. Why don't you give the email address one more time, and then we'll get out of here.
If you would like to ask us about any of the content on the show or just send in fun facts about trains, you can email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
Very good. That is the On Poly podcast for this March the 8th, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And if you already follow our show, help a friend follow it too.
Let's give the email address one more time, because any feedback you've got, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. onpolitics@tvo.org is the special email address to reach us. Be sure to include your first and last name and what part of the province or world for that matter. Until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Tired of endless scrolling on your cell phone or of seeing your kids do it? TVO's No-Brainers may have some advice for you. Have a look.
What happens when you overstimulate your brain with a full day of mindless scrolling and then hit the brakes by jumping into a sensory deprivation tank? I mean, who'd be dumb enough to try that? Recently, I've learned that I need people more than the internet. Seems obvious, I know. But harder than you'd think to actually do. And so my screen time has dropped hard, from 7 to 9 hours a day to about 2. And that new screen time number is primarily texting with my friends. So yay me! Go me! I beat my phone addiction. I'm happier, or at least better able to deal with unhappiness? Does that make sense? But what made it so hard to kick? What exactly is so addictive about this thing? I think a big part of it is this. The infinite scroll. It's the super simple, seemingly invisible user interface that wastes an estimated 200,000 lifetimes a day, and whose creator, Asa Raskin, has publicly regretted ever inventing it in the first place.
We've just invented a gun, and it can be pointed at anyone.
But why is it supposedly so bad for you? And what happens if you gorge yourself at this all-you-can-consume buffet of content? At a real buffet, it's simple. If you eat too much, you get sick. But what happens when your brain overeats? That's what I'm gonna find out doing this stupid experiment. The rules are simple. Once I start scrolling, I don't stop until I get into the sensory deprivation tank. I have to scroll while I walk, talk, eat, use the bathroom, ride a horse, anything. I can't look away from the screen for more than a couple seconds. I do have this though. A button that's not really hooked up to anything, but hitting it means that I can take a 5-minute break. Why, you ask? Because every single person I told about this experiment was like, "Oh, you poor thing, don't do this." They didn't say that when I hung off the CN Tower. But this, they're like, "Oh, you're gonna scramble your brain." Which doesn't make total sense to me because I'll be basically doing the same amount of screen time I used to do, the same amount of time millions of people regularly do every day, except all at once, with no breaks. And then I dramatically cut all sensory input. Advil for a headache. I'm gonna get one. This is my swimsuit for later in a takeout bag. My night guard. My dentist says when I get stressed out, then I hurt my jaw because I clench. So I only wear it when I sleep, but I'm gonna wear it like this and it makes me talk like a baby. Brought my blankie from home.
Why'd you bring your blanket?
Because I figured this would be really stressful and I would probably go crazy. I love my job. Quick history lesson. Before the scroll, the internet was just pages that you had to click through. Then, in 2006, engineer Asa Raskin invented the infinite scrolling design pattern, which was later refined and developed into a JavaScript plugin by Paul Irish. Now users could scroll seamlessly through posts or articles. By eliminating the need for page clicks, the scroll reduced bounce rates, made browsing more efficient, enhanced mobile use, and made real-time content more accessible. All great stuff. So why in 2019 did Raskin tweet, "One of my lessons from the infinite scroll, that optimizing something for ease of use does not mean the best for user or humanity?"
What can we do to have more of a setup in Magic Shadows in terms of the grid and all that stuff?
Raskin tweeted his regrets because, unbeknownst to its creators at the time, the endless scroll exploited a heuristic or mental shortcut that many people naturally use, the unit bias. Human beings are naturally motivated to complete a unit of something. The tendency is to believe that whatever amount we're given of something is the right amount. If I put out a bowl of candy, on average, people would take one. If I put out a spoon, they take a few more. A scoop, and they're filling their pockets. When the infinite scroll is everywhere, the same thing happens. Since the amount of content is endless, we keep swiping to clean a plate that can never be cleaned. I normally have nothing in my brain. And now it feels like there's a lot of things in there that I don't want them to be. And it feels really heavy and it hurts. That was unplanned. Haters will say it's fake. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that allow people to solve problems and make judgments quickly and efficiently, allowing people to function without constantly stopping to think about what they're doing. The scroll hijacks this autopilot. But sometimes we need to stop. I mean, how many times have we all gone online to do one thing, only to get distracted for hours with something else? And how many times have we beat ourselves up for it? But you know what? Like Sean says to Will 10 times in 47 seconds in my favorite movie, Good Will Hunting.
It's not your fault.
And really, it's not totally anyway. There are legions of very smart product designers out there who know that the most successful products are the ones that are habit-forming. If cigarette manufacturers publicly admitted they set out to make a habit-forming product, there'd be protests lined up around the block. But that's exactly what app developers do every day. And they give these little addictive apps to everyone, almost totally regardless of age, for free. And you know, when the product is free, that means you're not the customer. You're the product. Your attention, your data, your content is how they make their money. You know that, I don't have to tell you that, but I like to remind you.
I'm experiencing all of it right now. My neck hurts.
Is that Alex, my boss?
Are you okay?
You're not gonna go insane now. You're
Am I already there? Aww.
No, you can stop this anytime.
He got on the floor to speak to me. He's such a kind man.
This is the only posture that's comfortable right now.
Swiping from one random clip to another is one of the most addictive feedback loops out there. It's human nature to seek predictability and patterns, and when we can't find them, we search them out.
There's like a 90-year-old man doing an I'll Follow You Into the Dark Death Cab for Cutie cover. I want to watch it right now. Oh, we can watch Spot the F-Boy?
So we swipe on with no guarantee of reward, seeking completion for a pattern that doesn't exist. We just keep pulling that slot machine lever, hoping for a quick rush of dopamine. Why am I sweating? Which just trains our brain to keep coming back.
And at my Starbucks near my house, at the barista's favorite list, you can order, like, be barista's favorite, so I always order a large Sheila. I'm so exhausted. By the time I get there, I will have been scrolling for over 8.5 hours without any breaks, and I did not press the button. It's hard to swallow an Advil with a mouth guard in, but I did it. All right, let's go.
I don't remember what happened here other than I was very angry.
I haven't spoken to a single person looking in their eyes in 9 hours, so I can only look at the lens. It's actually hard to put the phone down. Like, I actually can't. I can't! I don't want to let go of it. Like, my hand doesn't want to. Like, I'm not being extra. It's like my hand doesn't want to.
Put it down.
I feel so bad. Like, she looks so lonely and sad.
I don't know what to do now.
I just want to give myself a hug.
I feel like I'm forgetting something. Oh my god, I'm 11. You can stretch and you're floating.
The guy who works there said you're supposed to go in with no intention and no concept of anything. And then what comes out of you is what you don't let come to the surface ever.
Yeah, I don't think I ever want to take it on TikTok or like watch them ever again. You know, I don't think I ever have a desire to make video content ever again.
I did my undergrad degree in making content. I love making content. I love telling stories. After 8 hours of this, that's bad. That's really bad. That's like my passion. That's like what I like, that's my whole thing I want to do for the rest of my life. I'm losing it. I think I'm spraying my eyes because I got salt water in my eyes again. Oh no, I'm gonna get so angry, I know it. Damn it!
Like, who has memories? Like, who has, like, good memories of, like, of something you saw on your screen? Children just, like, waste so much time on their phones.
Should I pause it?
You have something to say?
Yeah. I just felt gross. Like, something about, like, having somebody, like, shove content in your face all the time feels, like, abusive. The part that hurt the most about my screen time was when I did the math. Like I said before, I averaged about 7 hours a day. That's about 106 days a year. Say I lived to 74, that's 14 and a half years of my life scrolling. 14 and a half years chasing a reward that doesn't exist instead of doing literally anything else. Seriously, it made me really mad. It's not the content itself so much as the way it's presented. It is a freaking buffet. And none of us would eat a buffet every day. We'd be miserable. We're dead. And I'm positive I don't want to spend such a massive chunk of my life consuming content.
Wizards of Waverly Place reunion. 7 red flags you should never ignore. Sagittarius, February 2023. Trying to escape.
Insofar as the EV industry and the automotive industry, if we hold true to the long-standing process of paying well, we'll be fine.
Do we get a nodding of the head on that one?
Two nods.
Two nods. Okay.
First of all, on the point about meeting the employee numbers, I absolutely agree with you. But your earlier point is the most fascinating, right? This is part of our value proposition around the world. I say you can go to the States, go to Kentucky and have your battery built, 6% clean energy. They use coal. Go to Alabama and have your vehicle assembled, 18% clean energy. Build your car with steel made from coal. Or you can come to Ontario. You have 94%, arguably, clean energy assembling the vehicle. We'll sell clean energy credits to Stellantis and to Volkswagen. They'll have 100% clean energy battery. And thanks to ArcelorMittal, Dofasco, you are having the switch from coal to electric arc furnace. You will have green steel. Now think about driving with pride a vehicle built in Ontario with clean energy, green steel, versus any car built anywhere in the U.S.
Josipa.
This is a real proposition, and this one I do want us to get into a little bit here. The reality is anything built in Ontario and Canada is going to be expensive, right? We're not paying Mexican wages here. That's the truth of it. But what is the real proposition? Exactly as the minister flagged, and so did Greg. It is the green electricity. And this is not because these plants, again, have woken up as manufacturing CEOs and said, let's go green. Because if they had, they wouldn't have spent the last 15 years trying to sue the government of the United States to undo climate action, right? So what has happened is there's enough governments that have moved ahead saying, you're going to be hit with carbon pricing at the border. That's going to drive up the price of your products, no matter where you built it in coal producing, whatever jurisdiction of the world. It's going to become extremely expensive. You won't be able to sell your stuff. So now the proposition is really there, that we have a green grid. Back to my original point, though, the real ability to keep this investment through the long term in the ecosystem is to make sure our grid stays green, which means no to natural gas plants. It does mean upgrading Darlington and nuclear. It does mean continuing the investments in green energy.
We have, an unprecedented situation. 10 of, I think, 23 public universities reporting deficits right now. We have one university with many of thousands of their staff on strike. This is a drop in the bucket. And at the same time, for as much as the Premier might say that he's got the backs of students, not a single dollar is going towards OSAP in the midst of an affordability crisis.
The Student Assistance Plan.
Exactly. It's simply inadequate. It misses the mark entirely.
Mike Schreiner, your view.
Well, I think the Premier and his minister needs to go back to college and university to study math because their math doesn't add up. I mean, first of all, as Peggy said, the Blue Ribbon Panel said $2.5 billion over 3 years. They gave 1.2, half of that. That was before the federal government made their decision to cap international students. That's going to cost universities $1.8 billion. So the $400 million per year over the next 3 years is like 20% of just dealing with the cost of the international student cap. Ontario, as my colleagues have said, ranked last of all provinces. If we want to even get up to the national average, that would be funding of around $7 billion. So it doesn't add up, and it's hurting our students, it's hurting our economy, and it's hurting our post-secondary education sector.
You referenced the federal visa situation, and let's get into that right now, because that will deprive the post-secondary system, cutting back on the number of foreign students, by $1.8 billion, as you suggested, Mike. So, Alex, next question becomes, was that the right move for the feds to take, given the impact it's about to have on 47 colleges and universities across this province?
I'm not sure what other choices they had, to be honest with you. I mean, colleges in particular, Ontario colleges in particular, got greedy over the last 2 or 3 years, and they brought in more students. And yes, originally, for some of them, that was about making up for government cutbacks. There's no question that the amount of money coming in from international students vastly exceeded what was cut from the budget for colleges. So, you're from that part of you're from Conestoga's part of the world, where they went from 11,000 to 33,000 students, and you see what that did to the housing market. I think Mark Miller went out, was pretty consistent for about 6 months and saying, guys, I'm going to do this.
The federal
don't make me
immigration
do
minister.
this. Yes, Mark Miller, the federal immigration minister, said, don't make me do this. And everybody ignored him. They just assumed he couldn't do it. And we have the situation we have. I think you can say, all these international students they're kind of an externality of governments not paying for funding. They said, look, you can't get money from domestic students. We're not going to give you money. The only place you can go and get money are international students. You can bring in more of them. You can charge them more money. And that's how the system has been working for the last 12 years.
Next week on the agenda.
I am tired of me. I am bored of me. There's nothing interesting, in that way. There's something that's interesting in you. And I want to know what it is, and I know that there is. And the other 34 people in that class are really interesting.
That's next week on the agenda.